July 16, 1945, 5:29 a.m., Alamogordo, New Mexico. A light brighter than 1,000 suns erupts from the desert. Scientists watching from 10 miles away feel heat on their faces. The shockwave arrives seconds later, rattling observation bunkers. A mushroom cloud rises 7 miles into the sky, and J. Robert Oppenheimer, the brilliant physicist who led the Manhattan Project, whispers a line from Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The atomic bomb works. After 3 years, $2 billion, and the efforts of 130,000 people working in secret across multiple states, the United States has successfully created the most powerful weapon in human history. A single bomb with the destructive force of 20,000 tons of TNT, enough to obliterate an entire city in seconds. 12 days later, Harry S. Truman, a former haberdasher from Missouri, who'd been vice president for only 82 days before Roosevelt's death, thrust him into the presidency, sits in his office at the Potsdam Conference in Germany. He's just received confirmation of the successful test, and now he faces a decision that will haunt him and historians for the next 80 years. Japan is losing the war. Everyone knows it. Germany has surrendered. The Japanese Navy is destroyed. Japanese cities are being firebombed nightly. The Soviet Union is about to enter the war against Japan. Japanese defeat is inevitable. The only question is how much longer the war will last, and how many more people will die before it ends. Truman has 3 options. Each will end the war. Each will save American lives, the primary concern of an American president. But each carries a different cost in Japanese lives, in geopolitical consequences, in moral weight. Option 1, continue the conventional bombing campaign and naval blockade. Wait for Japan to surrender. American bombers are already devastating Japanese cities. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, all have been hit with massive firebombing raids. The March 9-10 raid on Tokyo killed more people than either atomic bomb will, approximately 100,000 dead in a single night. Japan's industrial capacity is being systematically destroyed. Their navy is gone. Their air force is depleted. A naval blockade is strangling imports. This option will work. Eventually. Japan cannot win. Japan cannot even effectively fight. Surrender is inevitable. But when? How many more months? How many more American casualties in continued Pacific campaigns? How many more Japanese civilians dead from bombing and starvation? Military estimates suggest Japan might hold out 6 months to a year. Casualty projections vary wildly, but even conservative estimates suggest tens of thousands more American deaths. And Japanese deaths from continued conventional bombing and blockade-induced starvation could reach into the millions. Option 2, invade Japan. Operation Downfall, the largest amphibious invasion in history. The military has plans ready. Operation Olympic in November 1945 would invade Kyushu, southern Japan. Operation Coronet in spring 1946 would invade Honshu and drive toward Tokyo. Total invasion force, 1.5 million American troops plus Commonwealth forces, against an estimated 2.3 million Japanese military personnel plus millions of armed civilians. Japan has made clear they will fight to the last person. Women and children are being trained to fight with bamboo spears. The slogan is, "The glorious death of 100 million." The entire Japanese population dying rather than surrendering. After seeing Japanese soldiers and civilians commit suicide rather than surrender on island after island, Saipan, Okinawa, Iwo Jima, American planners believe this threat is real. Casualty estimates are staggering and controversial. Some military estimates suggest 1 million American casualties, including 250,000 dead. Japanese casualties, military and civilian, could reach 10 million or more. The invasion would turn all of Japan into a battlefield. The atomic bombs would kill 200,000. An invasion might kill 10 million. But these are estimates, projections. Nobody knows for certain. What is certain is that an invasion means more American deaths, and Truman's primary obligation is to American soldiers. Option 3, use the atomic bomb. Demonstrate overwhelming force, make Japanese surrender inevitable and immediate. This is the option that will make Truman the only human being in history to order nuclear weapons used in warfare. This is the option that will kill between 150,000 and 250,000 Japanese civilians in 2 attacks. This is the option that will introduce nuclear weapons to warfare and begin the atomic age. But this is also the option that ends the war in days instead of months or years. This is the option that avoids invasion and its projected millions of casualties. This is the option that saves American lives with certainty rather than projections. Truman makes his decision. He will use the bomb. But that decision immediately generates more questions, each carrying its own moral weight. Which cities? Military targets? Cities with military significance but also large civilian populations? Pure civilian targets to maximize psychological impact? The Target Committee has prepared a list: Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, Nagasaki, Kyoto. Kyoto is removed. Secretary of War Henry Stimson honeymooned there and considers it too culturally significant. The others remain. How many warnings? Should they warn Japan that a super weapon is coming, tell them to surrender or face destruction, drop demonstration bombs on unpopulated areas to show the power without killing, or strike without warning to maximize shock and ensure Japanese leadership can't evacuate and disperse? The decision is made. Minimal warning. Leaflets will be dropped urging evacuation of certain cities, but not specifying why or mentioning the new weapon. The element of surprise is necessary for maximum impact. A demonstration might not convince Japanese leadership. They might claim it's a trick, or that America only has one bomb. Only actual use against real targets will prove the weapon's power and America's willingness to use it. One bomb or two? If one doesn't force surrender, how quickly should a second be used? The answers: use them as soon as they're ready. Show Japan that America can keep dropping these weapons until nothing remains. August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m., Hiroshima. The Enola Gay releases Little Boy, a uranium bomb with 15 kilotons yield. 43 seconds later, at 1,968 feet above the city, the bomb detonates. A fireball hotter than the surface of the sun vaporizes everything within half a mile. A shockwave traveling faster than sound crushes buildings for miles. Thermal radiation ignites fires across the city. People are instantly vaporized, leaving only shadows burned into walls. Others die over hours and days from radiation poisoning. Between 70,000 and 80,000 die instantly. By the end of 1945, the death toll reaches 140,000. Japan's leadership is stunned, but they don't immediately surrender. Some argue the bomb was a one-time weapon, that America couldn't possibly have more. Some argue that surrender is still unacceptable. The tradition of fighting to the death is too strong. Some want to negotiate terms rather than accept unconditional surrender. The debates continue. Truman has a second bomb ready. 3 days. That's all the time he gives Japan to respond. On August 9, 1945, Fat Man, a plutonium bomb, is loaded onto Boxcar. The primary target is Kokura, but weather forces diversion to the secondary target, Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m., the second atomic bomb detonates, between 40,000 and 75,000 dead immediately. Total deaths by end of year, approximately 70,000. August 15, 1945. 6 days after Nagasaki, 9 days after Hiroshima, Emperor Hirohito announces Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast, the first time most Japanese people have ever heard their emperor's voice. World War II is over. 2 bombs, 6 days, 200,000 dead. And the war that had killed 85 million people over 6 years finally ends. Was it the right decision? That question has been debated for 80 years. Truman never publicly expressed regret. He maintained until his death that he'd made the right choice, that the bombs saved more lives than they took, that invasion would have been worse, that ending the war quickly was worth the cost. But the debate never ends, because we can never know what would have happened if Truman had made a different choice. We know what did happen. We don't know what might have happened, and that uncertainty means the moral accounting can never be closed. Let me take you deeper into that decision, into the calculations, the assumptions, the pressures, the alternatives that Truman considered or didn't consider, into the question that has no satisfying answer. When, if ever, is it acceptable to kill 200,000 civilians to save a larger number of soldiers? The standard justification for using atomic bombs goes like this. Invasion of Japan would have cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and millions of Japanese lives. The atomic bombs, while devastating, killed far fewer people and ended the war immediately. Therefore, using the bombs was the lesser evil, a tragic but necessary choice that ultimately saved more lives than it cost. This argument depends entirely on the invasion casualty estimates being accurate. So let's examine those numbers, because they're far more controversial than most people realize. The most commonly cited figure, that invasion would have cost 1 million American casualties, comes from a 1946 report commissioned after the war ended, but documents from 1945, before the decision was made, show much lower estimates. The Joint War Plans Committee estimated 40,000 deaths in the first 30 days of Olympic and 150,000 total for the entire invasion. Other estimates range from 25,000 to 46,000 American deaths. Why the discrepancy? Some historians argue the higher estimates were calculated after the decision was made to justify it, that Truman and his advisors inflated the numbers to make the atomic bombs seem like the obviously correct choice. Others argue the lower estimates were overly optimistic and that combat experience on Okinawa, where Japanese resistance was fanatical, suggested casualties would be much higher. The truth is, we don't know. We can't know, because the invasion never happened. All we have are projections, estimates, guesses about what might have occurred, and those projections were based on assumptions that might have been wrong. The key assumption was that Japan would fight to the last person, that surrender was culturally impossible, that invasion would require killing or capturing virtually every Japanese soldier and armed civilian. This assumption was based on observed behavior on Pacific Islands where Japanese forces fought to the death rather than surrender. But Japan in 1945 was not an isolated island garrison. Japan was a nation of 70 million people running out of food, fuel, ammunition, and hope. The military leadership was divided. Some wanted to fight to the end, others recognized defeat was inevitable and wanted to negotiate surrender terms. The emperor himself was leaning toward surrender but constrained by military hardliners. What if the conventional bombing and blockade had continued for another few months? What if the Soviet declaration of war on August 8th, which many historians believe was as important as the atomic bombs enforcing surrender, had been given time to sink in? What if diplomatic channels had been explored more thoroughly? These questions can't be answered definitively, but they raise doubts about whether the atomic bombs were truly the only option to end the war without invasion. Let's examine the third option, the one rarely discussed in popular histories: conditional surrender. Japan's leadership, even the hardliners, had one primary concern: preservation of the emperor. They were willing to accept defeat, occupation, even war crimes trials, but they insisted the emperor must remain. This was non-negotiable for many Japanese leaders. The United States demanded unconditional surrender. This was Roosevelt's policy, maintained by Truman: no negotiations, no conditions. Total surrender or total destruction. But here's the irony. After Japan surrendered unconditionally, the United States allowed the emperor to remain. MacArthur, leading the occupation, decided keeping the emperor was politically useful. So the thing Japan wanted most, the condition they might have surrendered for months earlier, was ultimately granted anyway. What if the United States had signaled earlier that the emperor could remain? Would Japan have surrendered before the atomic bombs? Some historians argue yes, that Japan was looking for a way to surrender with honor, and clarity about the emperor's fate might have provided it. Others argue Japanese military leadership would have rejected any surrender, conditional or not, until the atomic bombs demonstrated that further resistance was futile. Again, we can't know, but it raises uncomfortable questions about whether diplomatic alternatives were fully explored before resorting to atomic weapons. Now let's talk about the targeting decisions, because they reveal something important about the moral calculations involved. The Target Committee's criteria for selecting cities were military significance, urban area size, and whether the city had been previously bombed. They wanted to demonstrate the bomb's full destructive power on a relatively intact city. They wanted to maximize psychological impact by showing that one bomb could destroy an entire city. But here's the crucial point. Every city on the target list had large civilian populations. Hiroshima had some military facilities. It was a military headquarters and embarkation port, but it was primarily a civilian city of 350,000 people. Nagasaki was even less military. It had shipyards and industry, but was primarily civilian. The committee discussed military-only targets. They could have bombed fleet concentrations, military bases, or industrial complexes isolated from civilian populations. They chose not to. The reasoning was that bombing military targets wouldn't demonstrate the weapon's city-destroying power and might not convince Japanese leadership that surrender was necessary. In other words, killing civilians wasn't collateral damage. It was the point. The goal was to shock Japanese leadership by demonstrating that America could and would destroy entire Japanese cities, civilian populations and all, until surrender was accepted. This is where the moral accounting becomes very uncomfortable, because once you accept that the goal is to kill enough civilians that the enemy's leadership surrenders, you've crossed a line that most people believe should never be crossed, deliberately targeting non-combatants to achieve military objectives. The Geneva Conventions, established after World War I, were supposed to protect civilians from being deliberately targeted, but strategic bombing, practiced by all sides in World War II, had already eroded that protection. British and American bombers were deliberately targeting German cities. Japanese forces had deliberately killed civilians in China. Soviet forces had committed atrocities in Eastern Europe. By 1945, the deliberate killing of enemy civilians had become normalized as a strategy for breaking enemy morale. The atomic bombs were the culmination of this logic, the ultimate civilian targeting weapon. Not a new kind of war crime, but the perfection of a war crime that had already become routine. And yet, the alternative might have been worse. If invasion had occurred, civilian casualties would likely have been far higher. Japanese civilians were being prepared to fight, handed bamboo spears, told to die rather than surrender, convinced that American forces would rape and murder them all. An invasion would have been a bloodbath for Japanese civilians, American soldiers, and whatever remained of Japan's military. This is the impossible calculation Truman faced. Deliberate mass murder of civilians versus probable larger-scale death from continued conventional warfare. There's no satisfying moral resolution. Both options involve massive loss of innocent life. The only question is which option kills fewer people, and even that calculation depends on projections and assumptions that can't be proven. Truman chose the atomic bombs, and whatever we think about that choice 80 years later, we need to understand the context in which it was made. 6 years of total war, 70 million dead, strategic bombing normalized, racism against Japanese that made their deaths seem less significant to American planners, pressure to end the war before Soviet involvement gave Stalin leverage in post-war negotiations, and genuine uncertainty about how long Japan could hold out and how many more would die. None of this makes the decision right or wrong, it makes it understandable, and understanding is necessary before judgment. August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m., Hiroshima. For the people directly under the bomb, death was instant. They were vaporized so quickly they left shadows burned into walls, the radiation hitting the wall around their bodies, creating a permanent silhouette. These shadows are still visible today in Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Museum. They're all that remains of thousands of human beings. For those within a kilometer but not directly under the blast, death came in seconds from the thermal pulse. Their skin burned away, their eyes melted, their internal organs cooked. Approximately 20,000 died this way. For those within 1 to 2 kilometers, the shockwave killed many instantly. Buildings collapsed, debris became shrapnel, bodies were crushed or impaled, another 40,000 dead in the first seconds. But tens of thousands more survived the initial blast only to face something humanity had never encountered before: acute radiation syndrome. They seemed fine at first, walking, talking, helping others. Then within hours or days, they began dying in ways doctors couldn't understand or treat. Hair falling out in clumps, uncontrollable bleeding from every orifice, skin sloughing off, internal organs failing, immune systems collapsing, children dying in their parents' arms from an invisible poison no one understood. Doctors trying to help but having no treatment, no protocol, no comprehension of what was killing their patients. Approximately 60,000 died from radiation in the weeks and months after Hiroshima. Another 20,000 died from radiation after Nagasaki. Their deaths were slower, more painful, more confusing than those who died in the blast, and their suffering was documented by Japanese doctors who tried desperately to understand and treat this new kind of injury. The American occupation forces initially suppressed this documentation. They censored reports of radiation effects. They confiscated medical records and research. They didn't want the world to know the full horror of what the atomic bombs had done. This wasn't just about winning the war. It was about controlling the narrative about nuclear weapons for the Cold War that was already beginning. But the survivors, Hibakusha, knew. They carried the physical and psychological scars. Many developed cancers years or decades later. Their children showed higher rates of birth defects and genetic damage. The radiation poisoning didn't just kill immediately, it damaged DNA, created cancers, harmed generations yet unborn. And beyond the physical damage was psychological trauma that never healed. Survivor's guilt. Why did I live when my family died? Fear of radiation? Am I still being poisoned? Will I develop cancer? Social stigma. Many Hibakusha faced discrimination in employment and marriage because people feared radiation was contagious or that their children would be deformed. The bombing created approximately 650,000 Hibakusha total. As of 2024, about 113,000 are still alive, mostly elderly. They've spent their lives bearing witness, telling their stories, warning humanity about nuclear weapons, and they've been largely ignored by the world's nuclear powers. Now let's talk about Truman's response to what he'd done. Publicly, Truman never expressed regret. He maintained the bombs saved lives. When challenged, he became defensive, even angry. In 1958, a journalist asked if he'd ever had second thoughts. Truman replied, "Second thoughts? Hell no, I'd do it again." But private letters and diary entries suggest more complexity. Truman wrote about the terrible responsibility of the decision. He told aides that ordering the bombs was the hardest thing he'd ever done. He seemed haunted by it, even as he defended it publicly. Some of the scientists who built the bomb had stronger reactions. Oppenheimer's Destroyer of Worlds, quote, captured his horror at what physics had made possible. He later campaigned against nuclear weapons development. Leo Szilard, who had helped initiate the Manhattan Project, spent the rest of his life advocating for nuclear disarmament. Many Manhattan Project scientists became anti-nuclear activists after seeing what their creation did to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But many others defended the decision. They argued the bombs ended the war, saved lives, demonstrated to the Soviet Union that America had weapons they couldn't match. They saw the bombings as tragic necessities rather than moral catastrophes. The immediate aftermath also raised questions about whether two bombs were necessary. Japan was already on the brink of surrender before Nagasaki. The Soviet declaration of war on August 8th between the two bombings may have been more decisive than the second bomb enforcing surrender. Some historians argue Nagasaki was unnecessary, that Japan would have surrendered after Hiroshima and the Soviet entry if given more than 3 days to process the shock. But Truman and his advisors wanted to demonstrate that America had multiple bombs and would keep using them. They wanted surrender immediately, not after weeks of Japanese leadership debating options. 3 days seemed sufficient time to decide. It wasn't. The long-term consequences of the decision extend far beyond Japan. The atomic bombings began the nuclear age, the era when humanity possessed weapons capable of destroying civilization. The Cold War nuclear arms race, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, the constant low-level terror that nuclear war might end everything, all of this traces back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The bombs also established a precedent that nuclear weapons could be used in warfare, that civilian populations were acceptable targets in total war, that victory justified any level of destructive force. This precedent has held for 79 years. No nuclear weapons have been used in warfare since Nagasaki. But the fact that they were used once means they can be used again. And with 9 nations now possessing nuclear weapons, the risk of future use remains. Some argue this is Hiroshima's true legacy, that by demonstrating the horror of nuclear weapons once, it made future use unthinkable. That the images of devastation, the testimonies of Hibakusha, the documentation of radiation effects created sufficient deterrent that nuclear powers have refrained from using them again, despite many opportunities and provocations over the past 79 years. Others argue the opposite, that by using nuclear weapons once and justifying it as necessary, Truman made future use more likely by establishing that, under the right circumstances, the moral prohibition can be overcome. That every nuclear power now tells itself, we would only use these weapons if absolutely necessary. The same justification Truman used. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki has created powerful restraints against nuclear use. But those restraints are psychological and political, not absolute. They could be overcome if leaders believed circumstances justified it, and the precedent exists that such justification is possible. This is Truman's legacy. He ended the worst war in human history by using the most destructive weapons ever created against civilian populations. He saved lives by taking lives. He prevented a potentially more devastating invasion by ordering an instantly devastating attack. and he began the nuclear age with all its dangers by demonstrating that atomic weapons work, that they can be used, and that leaders will use them if they believe the alternative is worse. History hasn't reached consensus on whether he was right. It probably never will, because the question isn't just historical, it's philosophical, moral, eternal. When, if ever, is mass killing justified to prevent potentially greater mass killing? And who gets to make that calculation? The most painful aspect of Truman's decision isn't what happened, it's what might have happened, because every alternative path carries its own horror, its own death toll, its own moral weight, and we can never know which path would have been less terrible. Alternative 1. Demonstration bombing. Some Manhattan Project scientists, including Szilard and Einstein, advocated for a demonstration. Invite Japanese observers to watch an atomic bomb destroy an uninhabited island. Show them the power without killing anyone. Give them undeniable proof that resistance is futile. Then demand surrender. This sounds humane. It would have avoided the immediate deaths. But would it have worked? Japanese leadership had already endured months of conventional bombing destroying their cities. They knew they were losing. One more explosion on an empty island might not have convinced hardliners that surrender was necessary. Moreover, a demonstration would have revealed America's card without playing it. Japan would know exactly what weapon they faced. They could disperse their leadership, evacuate cities, prepare their population psychologically. The shock value would be lost. And what if the demonstration failed? Not that the bomb didn't work, but that it failed to convince Japan to surrender? America only had 2 bombs ready in August 1945. Using one on a demonstration meant having only one left for actual warfare. If Japan called the bluff, what then? Still, the demonstration option raises the question, was the attempt made? Did Truman seriously consider it or dismiss it quickly? Historical records suggest it was discussed but rejected relatively easily because military and political advisors convinced Truman it wouldn't work. Whether they were right, we'll never know. Alternative 2. Conditional surrender. What if America had clearly communicated that Japan could keep the emperor before the bombs were dropped? Would Japan have surrendered, making the atomic bombs unnecessary? This is the alternative that most haunts historians because the evidence suggests it might have worked. Japan's leadership was divided, but even hardliners wanted to preserve the imperial system. If Truman had explicitly stated the emperor could remain, the doves in Japan's government might have convinced the hawks that honorable surrender was possible. But Truman faced political pressure to demand unconditional surrender. Roosevelt had established that policy. The American public, after 4 years of war, wanted complete victory with no negotiations. Offering conditions might have been seen as weakness, might have extended the war, might have emboldened Japanese hardliners to demand more concessions. And there's no guarantee it would have worked. Some Japanese military leaders were so committed to fighting to the end that even preserving the emperor might not have been sufficient. They might have rejected any surrender, conditional or not, until faced with the undeniable reality of atomic destruction. Alternative 3. Wait for Soviet entry. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8, 1945, between Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Soviet forces invaded Manchuria, crushing the Japanese Kwantung Army rapidly. Many historians believe this Soviet entry was as important as the atomic bombs in forcing Japanese surrender, perhaps more important. Japan had been hoping the Soviet Union would mediate a negotiated peace. Soviet neutrality was Japan's last diplomatic hope. When the Soviets instead declared war and invaded, that hope evaporated. Suddenly, Japan faced a 2-front war against the world's 2 largest military powers with no possibility of negotiated settlement. What if Truman had waited for Soviet entry before using the bombs? What if the shock of Soviet invasion had been enough to force surrender without atomic weapons? This alternative is complicated by Cold War politics. Truman knew Soviet entry was imminent. He may have wanted to end the war before Soviet involvement could give Stalin leverage in determining post-war arrangements in Asia. Using the atomic bombs quickly meant America could dictate terms without Soviet participation. This was geopolitically advantageous for the United States. So the atomic bombs may have served a dual purpose, forcing Japanese surrender and limiting Soviet influence in post-war Japan and Asia. If this was a factor in Truman's decision, and some historians believe it was, then the moral calculation becomes even more complicated. Were 200,000 Japanese civilians killed partly to send a message to Stalin? Alternative 4. Continue conventional bombing and blockade. Japan was already being destroyed by conventional means. American bombers were running out of targets. The naval blockade was strangling Japan's economy. Food shortages were becoming famine. The infrastructure necessary for modern life was being systematically demolished. What if Truman had just continued this strategy? No invasion, no atomic bombs, just sustained conventional bombing and blockade until Japan's government concluded that further resistance was pointless. This would have avoided the atomic bomb's radiation and the precedent of nuclear weapon use. But the death toll might have been higher. Months more of bombing would have killed tens or hundreds of thousands more Japanese civilians. Famine from the blockade would have killed hundreds of thousands or millions, and every additional month meant thousands more Allied prisoners of war dying in Japanese camps, thousands more Asian civilians dying under Japanese occupation, thousands more Allied soldiers dying in continued Pacific operations. This alternative probably would have worked eventually. Japan couldn't win. Surrender was inevitable. But the timeline was uncertain and the costs potentially enormous. Truman chose immediate decisive action over gradual strangulation. Was he right? We can't know because we don't know how long Japan would have held out. The counterfactual that changes everything. What if the bombs didn't work? Here's a scenario rarely considered. What if the atomic bombs had been dropped but Japan still didn't surrender? What if it took 3 bombs, or 4, or 5? What if Japanese leadership was so committed to fighting to the end that even atomic destruction couldn't break their will? America was producing more bombs. By September 1945, 3 more would be ready. By October, 3 more. The production pipeline was accelerating. If Japan hadn't surrendered after 2 bombs, Truman would have faced the decision of whether to keep dropping them until Japan was completely destroyed or until surrender was achieved. This nightmare scenario, atomic bombs becoming just another weapon of attrition warfare, almost happened. Japan's surrender came 6 days after Hiroshima, 3 days after Nagasaki. But it was a close decision. The Japanese military leadership was divided. The emperor had to personally intervene to break the deadlock. If hardliners had prevailed, if the emperor had been unwilling to act, Japan might have continued fighting even after Nagasaki. What then? More atomic bombs? Invasion with atomic bomb support? Continued conventional bombing while preparing more nuclear strikes? Truman would have had to decide how many Japanese cities to destroy before concluding that atomic weapons alone wouldn't force surrender. This is the alternative that justifies his decision to those who support it. Faced with the possibility that Japan might not surrender, even after atomic bombing, using the bombs immediately and decisively was the best chance to shock them into surrender before the war escalated into either nuclear attrition or conventional invasion. The quick, devastating double blow worked precisely because it didn't give Japan time to process, rationalize, or steel themselves for continued resistance. But it's also the alternative that condemns his decision to those who oppose it. If there was even a possibility that atomic bombs wouldn't work, that suggests pursuing other alternatives, especially conditional surrender with explicit protection of the emperor, was the more responsible path. 80 years later, we still don't have answers. We have only questions that can't be settled because history only happens once. Truman made his choice. The bombs were dropped. Japan surrendered. And millions of lives that might have been lost in the alternatives were saved, or perhaps would have been saved anyway through different means. We'll never know. What we do know is that 200,000 people died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Real people, with names and families and dreams and futures. They died in seconds or days or months from fire or blast or radiation. Their deaths ended World War II. Whether those deaths were necessary, we continue to debate. Whether they were justified, we continue to argue. Whether Truman was right, we will never agree. But we can agree on this. The decision to use atomic weapons against civilian populations was the most consequential decision of the 20th century. And understanding that decision, its context, its alternatives, its consequences, is essential to ensuring it never happens again. Harry Truman lived another 27 years after Hiroshima. He left the presidency in 1953, returning to Missouri where he lived quietly until his death in 1972. Throughout those years, he was repeatedly asked about the atomic bombs, and his answer never changed. I made the right decision. I would do it again. But Truman's certainty doesn't settle the moral question, because moral questions about killing 200,000 civilians don't have simple answers. They have only frameworks for thinking about impossible choices. Here's what we can learn from Truman's decision, beyond the historical details, beyond the specific context of World War II. These are lessons about how leaders make decisions when every option is terrible, when certainty is impossible, and when the stakes are millions of lives. Lesson 1. Projected outcomes are not certain outcomes. Truman's decision was based on projections of what would happen if he chose differently. Projections said invasion would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and millions of Japanese lives. Projections said conventional bombing would take many more months and kill hundreds of thousands more. Projections said Japan wouldn't surrender without decisive demonstration of overwhelming force. But projections are educated guesses, not certainties. The invasion might have cost fewer lives than projected. Japan might have surrendered sooner than expected. Alternatives might have worked better than anticipated. We can never know because projections were treated as facts in the decision-making process. This is a fundamental problem in decision-making under uncertainty. We act on best available information, but that information is often incomplete or wrong. Leaders who make consequential decisions based on projections must acknowledge uncertainty. Truman's certainty that he'd made the right choice suggests he may not have fully grappled with how uncertain the alternative outcomes actually were. Lesson 2. Short-term costs versus long-term consequences. The atomic bombs ended World War II in days. That's the short-term outcome Truman was optimizing for, but the long-term consequence was the nuclear age, 79 years and counting of humanity living under the threat of nuclear annihilation, with 9 nations possessing weapons that could destroy civilization. Did Truman adequately consider these long-term consequences? Could he have anticipated them? The scientists who built the bombs were warning about nuclear arms races, about the danger of proliferation, about the impossibility of keeping nuclear secrets forever. But Truman was focused on ending the immediate war, not on the geopolitical landscape of 1960 or 2024. Leaders making decisions about new weapons, new technologies, new tactics must weigh not just immediate utility, but long-term consequences. The atomic bombs worked in 1945, but did they make the world safer or more dangerous? Truman couldn't have known for certain, but he could have given more weight to the warnings he was receiving. Lesson 3. Moral prohibitions can be rationalized away. Deliberately targeting civilians violates just war theory, Geneva Conventions, and basic moral intuitions about the difference between combatants and non-combatants. Yet Truman ordered exactly that, targeting 2 cities with large civilian populations to maximize death and psychological impact. How did this become acceptable? Through gradual normalization. Strategic bombing of cities had been practiced by all sides for years. The firebombing of Tokyo and Dresden killed as many or more than the atomic bombs. By August 1945, mass civilian deaths from bombing had become routine. The atomic bombs were just a more efficient version of what was already happening. This is how moral prohibitions erode, not through sudden dramatic decisions to commit atrocities, but through gradual normalization of practices that slide toward atrocity. Each step seems justified compared to the previous step. By the time you've crossed fundamental moral lines, you've forgotten they were lines at all. The lesson: moral principles must be defended actively, consciously, explicitly, especially in wartime when the temptation to rationalize their violation is strongest. Once you accept that this time is different, that exceptional circumstances justify exceptional measures, you've opened a door that's very difficult to close. Lesson 4. Winners write history, but history isn't settled. Truman won. America won. Japan surrendered. In the immediate aftermath, the decision to use atomic bombs was celebrated as brilliant strategy that saved American lives and ended the war. Truman was praised for making a tough but necessary choice. But history's judgment has become less certain over time, as more documents have been declassified, as more perspectives have been considered. As the long-term consequences of nuclear weapons have become clear, the certainty has eroded. Today, historians are divided. Public opinion is divided. Even military historians who specialize in World War II can't agree on whether Truman was right. This should make us skeptical of immediate certainty about any major decision, The fact that a decision worked in the short term doesn't prove it was the best available option. The fact that winners justify their choices doesn't make those justifications true. History requires constant re-examination as new evidence emerges and perspectives shift. Lesson 5. The burden of decision falls on individuals. Truman made the final decision, but he inherited a situation created by years of policy choices. Roosevelt's demand for unconditional surrender, the decision to prioritize the atomic bomb's development, the strategic bombing campaigns that normalized civilian targeting, the military planning that assumed invasion would be necessary. All of these choices, made by many people over years, created the context in which Truman had to decide. Yet Truman alone carries the historical weight of ordering the bombs dropped. He's the one whose name is attached to the decision. He's the one who had to live with it. He couldn't diffuse responsibility by pointing to all the other decisions that led to his choice. This is the burden of leadership. You make decisions within constraints created by others, based on information provided by others, but you alone are accountable for the outcome. Truman understood this. He famously kept a sign on his desk, "The buck stops here." He accepted that responsibility even when it meant carrying the weight of 200,000 deaths for the rest of his life. Lesson 6. There are no good options, only less bad ones. This is perhaps the most important lesson. Truman didn't have good options. He had. Option A. Kill 200,000 civilians immediately with atomic bombs. Option B. Kill potentially millions over months with conventional weapons and blockade. Option C. Kill potentially millions in an invasion. Every option meant mass death. Every option meant tragedy. There was no choice that would end the war cleanly, morally, without enormous loss of life. Truman's decision wasn't between right and wrong. It was between different versions of terrible. This is the reality of leadership in extremis. Sometimes every available option is bad, and the best you can do is choose the option you believe is least bad and accept the moral weight of that choice. Truman chose immediate, decisive action over prolonged suffering. He chose certainty of 200,000 deaths over uncertainty of potentially millions. He chose American lives over Japanese lives, which is what an American president should do, even though it meant accepting that his choice would kill enormous numbers of non-combatants. Was he right? There's no objective answer. There are only different frameworks for evaluating his choice, each reaching different conclusions. The utilitarian framework. Did the bombs save more lives than they took? If invasion would have killed millions, then yes. If Japan would have surrendered soon anyway through conventional means, then no. We can't know which counterfactual is accurate. The deontological framework. Is deliberately killing civilians ever morally acceptable? If you believe some acts are inherently wrong regardless of consequences, then Truman's choice was immoral even if it saved lives. If you believe all moral reasoning must account for consequences, then the calculus becomes more complicated. The just war framework. Just war theory requires discrimination between combatants and non-combatants. The atomic bombs violated this principle, but just war theory also requires proportionality. Is the harm caused proportionate to the military objective? If the objective was ending history's most devastating war, and the alternative was potentially greater harm, was it proportionate? Different just war theorists reach different conclusions. The geopolitical framework. Did Truman's decision serve American interests beyond ending the war? Did demonstrating nuclear capability to the Soviet Union, establishing post-war dominance in Asia, and avoiding Soviet participation in Japan's occupation factor into his calculation? If so, were 200,000 Japanese lives acceptable cost for American geopolitical advantage? This framework reveals the coldest possible interpretation of the decision. 80 years later, we still can't agree which framework is correct, and perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps decisions this consequential should never be settled. Perhaps we should continue debating, questioning, examining Truman's choice, because that ongoing debate keeps us vigilant about nuclear weapons and the circumstances under which their use might be considered. The final question: what would you have done? It's easy to judge Truman from 80 years' distance. It's easy to say what he should have done when we're not facing the decision, when we don't feel the pressure of continued war, when we're not responsible for American soldiers still dying in the Pacific. But imagine you're Truman. It's July 1945. You've been president for 3 months. You didn't ask for this decision. Roosevelt died and left it to you. Your military advisors are telling you invasion will cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. Your scientists are telling you the atomic bomb will work. Your political advisors are telling you the American public demands decisive victory. You have a weapon that can end the war in days. Do you use it? If you say no and the war continues for months and thousands more Americans die, their blood is on your hands. You had a weapon that could have saved them, and you didn't use it. You chose Japanese lives over American lives, and you'll answer to American voters and to the families of dead American soldiers. If you say yes and 200,000 Japanese civilians die, their blood is on your hands. You ordered weapons dropped on cities full of non-combatants. You introduced nuclear weapons to warfare. You began the atomic age with all its terrors, and you'll answer to history for that choice. There's no answer that leaves your hands clean. There's no choice that lets you sleep well. There's only the awful responsibility of deciding based on imperfect information under enormous pressure with millions of lives hanging on your judgment. Truman made his choice. He chose the atomic bombs. He ended the war. He saved some lives and took others. He introduced nuclear weapons to warfare and began the age of potential nuclear annihilation. He made a decision that historians still debate, that ethicists still argue about, that philosophers still examine. Was he right? We'll never know for certain. But we can learn from his choice. We can understand the frameworks and pressures and calculations that led to it. We can examine our own capacity for rationalizing terrible actions when circumstances seem to demand them. We can prepare ourselves to recognize when we're facing similar situations, not identical but structurally similar, where every option is terrible and we must choose anyway. And we can commit to never forgetting the 200,000 who died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not to dishonor Truman, not to condemn America, but to remember that nuclear weapons are real, that they kill in horrible ways, that the decision to use them is not abstract or theoretical but concrete and devastating. The shadows burned into Hiroshima's walls are still visible. The hibakusha still tell their stories while they remain alive. The mushroom clouds captured in photographs remain iconic symbols of humanity's capacity for destruction. These aren't just historical artifacts. They're warnings, reminders, evidence of what happens when terrible options become the only options and someone has to choose. Harry Truman chose, and we live with the consequences of his choice every day in a world where 9 nations possess weapons that could end civilization, where nuclear deterrence is the only thing preventing their use, where the precedent of Hiroshima and Nagasaki exists as both warning and permission. Learn from his choice, understand its complexity, recognize the frameworks and pressures that made it seem necessary, question whether it was right, and commit to ensuring that we never create situations where leaders face similar choices, where the only options are different versions of catastrophe, where millions of lives hang on projections and calculations and imperfect information. Because the next time might not be just 2 cities, the next time might be civilization itself. That's Truman's legacy. That's Hiroshima's warning. That's the lesson we must never forget.